I never thought sitting next to my neighbor could change everything, until she said, "Sit beside me, right here." The first time I noticed her, I wasn't sure what caught my attention, the way the late afternoon sunlight danced across her hair, or the subtle calm in the way she moved around her apartment balcony. There was something almost effortless in her presence, a quiet confidence that made the world feel slower whenever she was near. I found myself pausing, pretending to check my phone, just so I could watch her without feeling obvious. If you like my story, then subscribe my channel. She was arranging a small collection of potted plants, her hands gentle as they adjusted each leaf. The faint scent of jasmine lingered in the air, mixing with the warmth of the sun. I could hear her soft hum, a tune that seemed too private for anyone else, and it drew me closer without me even realizing it. I noticed her laugh, quiet and easy, as a bird landed nearby, and my chest tightened just a little at the sound. We had shared this building for months, yet I had never seen her like this. Always polite in passing, a nod or a smile in the hallway, never anything more. But here she seemed human in a way that invited attention. I couldn't help but wonder what her story was, what had led to the gentleness in her eyes and the grace in her movements. The next day, I found myself lingering by the same balcony, pretending to water my own plants, just to see her again. She noticed, of course. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and I caught the smallest flicker of recognition, an acknowledgement that she had noticed me noticing her. That tiny moment was enough to make my heart pound, a curious warmth spreading through me, unfamiliar and thrilling. There was a rhythm to her presence that I wanted to understand. I watched her sip tea by the rail, her fingers curling lightly around the cup, the steam rising and catching the sunlight in a way that made everything feel slow and golden. I tried to remember details, the color of her scarf, the softness of her hair as it fell against her shoulder, but even noticing them made me self-conscious. Still, I couldn't look away. I realized then that something had shifted in me. It wasn't just attraction, it was curiosity, admiration, and a strange, quiet longing that I couldn't name. And even though I hadn't spoken a single word to her yet, I felt a connection forming, subtle but undeniable. Something in the way she existed in that space made me want to step closer, to learn more, to somehow become part of that gentle orbit without disturbing it. From that moment on, I knew our paths would cross differently. My heart had already begun to notice hers, even if our words hadn't caught up yet. The slow tension had begun, and I had no idea how far it would pull me. The next weekend, I found myself lingering near her balcony again, this time under the pretense of fixing a small leak in my own window. I didn't expect her to notice me immediately, but she did. That quiet acknowledgement of my presence, the slight tilt of her head, a soft smile playing on her lips, made my chest tighten in ways I wasn't ready to analyze. Then she said it. A voice calm, deliberate, and somehow warm enough to stop my thoughts entirely. "Sit beside me, right here." I froze for a second, unsure if I had heard correctly. The words were simple, ordinary even, yet the way she spoke them carried an intimacy that made my heartbeat quicken. Hesitation rooted me to the spot. I was 24, awkwardly aware of my own fumbling tendencies, and here was a woman who carried herself with effortless grace, inviting me into her personal space. If you like my story, then subscribe my channel. I stepped closer slowly, my palms tingling as I reached the edge of her small balcony. She gestured lightly toward a chair beside her, one that had clearly been waiting for me, as if she had known all along that I would eventually come. The city hummed below us, distant traffic, occasional laughter, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, but all of that faded into background noise the moment I sat down. The warmth radiating from her side was subtle, yet I felt it immediately, and for a second, it felt like the space between us had disappeared entirely. We didn't speak right away. There was a pause, a shared quiet that wasn't awkward but comfortable, almost like a conversation without words. She poured tea into 2 cups and handed me one, her fingers brushing lightly against mine. The contact was fleeting, yet it lingered in my awareness far longer than it should have, a spark of connection in the most ordinary gesture. Conversation began slowly, hesitant at first, like dipping a toe into cold water. She asked about my weekend, I asked about hers. Topics meandered, books we liked, music that lingered in our minds, the occasional funny observation about the neighbors or city life. Each word, each laugh, each tilt of her head seemed to draw me closer, pulling me into a rhythm that was both exhilarating and comforting. Her presence was magnetic yet gentle. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a quiet invitation to exist in her space, side by side. I found myself leaning slightly toward her without realizing it, drawn by the warmth of her gaze and the easy cadence of her voice. I was aware of the faint scent of jasmine, the way her hair fell over her shoulder, and the subtle rise and fall of her chest with each breath. Each small detail anchored me, making the moment feel more real, more significant than it had any right to. By the time I stood to leave, I realized that sitting beside her, even for a short while, had left a quiet ache in me. It was a longing I couldn't name yet, a pull I wasn't ready to resist. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I would return. The balcony was no longer just her space, it was ours, a small stage where subtle tension and quiet curiosity would begin to unfold. And I had a feeling that whatever started here would linger in ways I couldn't yet imagine. A few days after that quiet balcony encounter, I found myself thinking about her more than I'd expected. The way she moved, the subtle warmth of her presence, the unspoken understanding in her eyes, it lingered with me, pulling at a part of me I hadn't acknowledged before. When she texted later that afternoon, "I have some free time, care to join me on the balcony?" My heart raced with a mix of anticipation and hesitation. Sitting beside her again, I noticed small details I had missed before, the faint crease at the corner of her eyes when she smiled, the delicate way her fingers traced the rim of her teacup, the softness in her gaze when she looked at me. The city below buzzed on, distant and unimportant, as if the world had contracted to this small balcony and the quiet space we shared. If you like my story, then subscribe my channel. This time, our conversation drifted toward more personal territory. She spoke of her past with a vulnerability that surprised me, a quiet admission of moments of loneliness, decisions she'd second-guessed, dreams she had put aside for practicality. Her voice didn't tremble, but there was an honesty in it that made me lean closer, silently offering my attention, my empathy. I found myself opening up too, something I rarely did with anyone. I spoke about the uncertainty of my early 20s, the pressure of expectations, and the ways I sometimes felt invisible even in a room full of people. She listened, not just politely, but truly, her eyes locked on mine, her presence steady and grounding. There was no judgment, only an unspoken reassurance that my thoughts and feelings were valid, that they mattered. The moments of silence between us were no longer uncomfortable. They became their own kind of dialogue. I could feel her presence in subtle ways, the warmth radiating from her side, the brush of her sleeve against my arm when she reached for her cup, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the evening air. Every small gesture held weight, and every glance carried an unspoken connection I couldn't yet put into words. At one point, she reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, her fingers brushing lightly against my cheek. The touch was brief, but the sensation lingered long after, and I became acutely aware of how much I wanted to linger in that space with her. My heart felt full and heavy all at once, a mixture of anticipation, longing, and the uncharted vulnerability of being seen so openly. By the time I left, the city lights had flickered on, and the balcony felt emptier than it had when I arrived. Yet the memory of her closeness stayed with me, an echo of warmth, of understanding, of something that had begun quietly but with undeniable intensity. I realized that what had started as curiosity was growing into something deeper, something that would require courage to acknowledge fully. That evening, as I replayed our conversation in my mind, I understood that the slow burn of what was between us wasn't just about attraction. It was about connection, about being seen and accepted, about the tentative steps two people could take towards something meaningful, even if either of us was quite ready to name it yet. After our conversations on the balcony, something shifted between us. The familiarity of her presence began to feel like home, a soft, unspoken comfort that wrapped around me every time we were near. That Saturday, she invited me to help her carry a few boxes from her apartment down to the car. It was an ordinary task, but the shared activity created a closeness neither of us had consciously sought, yet neither could deny. As we maneuvered a particularly heavy box together, our hands brushed briefly, fingers grazing in a fleeting spark of awareness. She looked at me, her lips curving into a soft, knowing smile. It wasn't flirtation, at least, not in the way I would have expected, but a gentle acknowledgement of our growing connection. The subtle warmth of her hand, even in passing, left a lingering echo in my chest. If you like my story, then subscribe my channel. Later, as we rested on the balcony with tea, she absent-mindedly tucked a loose strand of my hair behind my ear, her fingers lingering a second longer than necessary. My pulse quickened, yet I didn't pull away. There was a weight to her touch, a quiet intention that made me more aware of every small gesture between us. I noticed the gentle tilt of her head when she laughed, the way her shoulder brushed mine when we reached for the same cup, the faint scent of her perfume in the warm evening air. Our conversation that day wandered effortlessly, touching on memories of childhood, favorite books, and the small joys of everyday life. Yet beneath the words, there was an unspoken dialogue, a rhythm in our glances, in the way our knees occasionally brushed, in the comfortable silence that settled when neither of us had anything to say. Every small gesture felt loaded with meaning, an intimacy that didn't require verbal confirmation. At one point, she leaned slightly closer to point something out on the balcony railing, and I could feel the warmth radiating from her side. My own instinct was to inch just a fraction closer, drawn to her presence as naturally as a leaf turns toward the sun. The subtle electricity between us was quiet but undeniable, a slow burn that didn't need words to exist. I realized that these ordinary tasks and shared moments were teaching me something profound about connection. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about noticing the small things, how she rested her hand near mine, how our laughter mingled in the quiet of the evening, how a shared glance could carry the weight of understanding. Every brush of her fingers against mine, every casual touch, was slowly building a language of closeness that neither of us had fully articulated. By the time I left that day, I felt a quiet ache of longing, the kind that comes not from desire alone but from a deep sense of recognition, that someone else could make the world feel simultaneously warmer, safer, and more thrilling. The balcony, the boxes, the quiet touches, they had all become a stage for something unfolding far beyond ordinary friendship, and I couldn't wait to see where it would lead. A week later, I found myself lingering on the balcony again, though this time with a nervousness I hadn't felt before. The space between us no longer felt simply familiar, it carried a quiet tension, a sense that something unspoken was hovering in the air. I could feel it in the way she moved, the subtle glance that lingered just a fraction too long, the small hesitation before she spoke. We had shared tea, laughter, and quiet conversations, but today felt different. She looked at me across the railing, her gaze steady yet soft, and my chest tightened as though it understood something my mind had yet to name. "You've been quiet today," she said, her voice low, curious but not probing. There was care in it, a gentle invitation to reveal myself, to share whatever I was holding back. "If you like my story, then subscribe my channel." I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. My thoughts tangled with the awareness of the age difference, of the unusual dynamic that drew me to her yet made me question every feeling. And then, almost instinctively, I spoke, words I hadn't fully formed, but which needed to be said. I think about you more than I probably should," I admitted, voice quiet, uncertain. "And I don't know why it feels so easy to be here with you, yet so complicated at the same time." She listened, as she always did, with that rare attentiveness that made me feel both exposed and safe. Her hand found mine, resting gently, not demanding, not apologizing, just there. The simple touch made the tension swell, yet it also grounded me. I could feel the warmth radiating from her hand, the faint tremor of her fingers brushing against mine, and I realized that she, too, was navigating unspoken emotions. Her response was measured, honest, and full of the quiet vulnerability I had grown to notice in her. "I've felt it too," she said softly. This connection. It's been here from the start, but I wasn't sure if it was okay to notice it, or to let it grow. Her gaze never wavered, and in that moment, the world around us, the distant traffic, the rustling leaves, the city lights beginning to glow, fell away. All that remained was the fragile, luminous tension between us. We spent the rest of the evening side by side, talking in hushed tones, laughing softly, and sharing silence that spoke louder than words. The occasional brush of knees, the gentle tilt of her head toward mine, the warmth of her shoulder close to me, it all became a quiet language, conveying more than either of us dared to say outright. By the time I left, I was aware that nothing had been fully resolved, yet everything had shifted. The hesitation, the unspoken longing, the subtle confessions, they had all pulled us closer, weaving an emotional tapestry that neither of us could ignore. And as I walked back to my apartment, I realized that the slow burn between us was no longer simply a possibility. It was becoming inevitable. After that evening of quiet confessions, our dynamics shifted in ways both tender and exhilarating. We were no longer just neighbors sharing casual conversation. We were two people discovering a connection that demanded patience, attention, and care. Every interaction became a small study in closeness, gestures, glances, and pauses carrying the weight of what we hadn't fully said aloud. She invited me over on a rainy afternoon, the kind of gentle drizzle that makes the world feel cocooned and private. As I approached her door, I felt a flutter of anticipation and nervousness, a mix of excitement and the lingering self-doubt that always accompanied my thoughts about her. When she opened the door, she greeted me with that soft smile that had already become so familiar, and for a moment, I thought the rain outside had nothing on the warmth I felt stepping inside. If you like my story, then subscribe my channel. We settled on the couch, a shared blanket draped casually over our laps. She had brewed our favorite teas, the fragrant steam curling into the air between us, carrying a subtle hint of jasmine and cinnamon. I handed her the cup, our fingers brushing lightly, and she allowed the touch to linger a fraction longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of the growing intimacy. It was in these small gestures that our unspoken understanding flourished. As the rain tapped gently against the window, we talked about life, dreams, and fleeting moments of beauty we often overlooked. She laughed at a story I told, the sound soft and melodic, and I reached out instinctively to tuck a strand of her hair behind her ear. Her cheek tilted slightly, leaning into the motion, and my pulse raced with the realization that she trusted me, allowed me into her personal space in a way that felt deeply intimate yet entirely safe. Later, I noticed she had placed her hand near mine on the blanket. I didn't move, didn't speak, simply let my fingers brush hers, tracing the warmth and reassurance in the contact. There was no rush, no need for grand declarations. It was the steady, quiet affirmation of presence. I am here. You are safe. We are together. She caught me staring at her, and instead of teasing, she smiled, her eyes soft with unspoken emotion. The gentle tilt of her head, the way her shoulder brushed mine as she reached for her tea, the faint warmth that radiated from her side, it all communicated more than words ever could. It was a subtle promise, a mutual understanding that our connection was growing, slow but certain. By the time I left that afternoon, I felt a sense of peace and exhilaration intertwined. Our bond was no longer tentative. It was deliberate, nurtured through small touches, shared spaces, and moments of vulnerability. The age gap, which might have been a barrier in another context, now felt irrelevant, overshadowed by the warmth, trust, and mutual respect that defined our growing intimacy. For the first time, I realized that love didn't always need fireworks to announce itself. Sometimes it unfolded in quiet gestures, lingering glances, and the tender weight of shared presence, and that was exactly what we had begun to build together. It had been weeks since that rainy afternoon, but the connection between us had only deepened, unfolding quietly with each shared cup of tea, each lingering conversation, and each subtle touch that neither of us rushed to define. The slow burn of our relationship had transformed into a comfortable rhythm, moments of laughter, vulnerability, and gentle intimacy that felt entirely ours. One evening, she invited me to watch the sunset from the rooftop of our building. The sky blazed with streaks of orange and gold, the city below bathed in a soft, fading light. We settled on a blanket, side by side, our shoulders touching ever so slightly. The warmth of her presence radiated through me, familiar and comforting, and I realized how deeply I had come to rely on it. If you like my story, then subscribe my channel. We spoke little at first, simply enjoying the quiet company. Her hand brushed mine as she adjusted the blanket, and I didn't move away. Instead, I let the touch linger, savoring the subtle electricity it brought. She caught my glance and smiled, a soft, knowing curve of her lips, her eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. In that moment, I understood that we didn't need grand gestures or declarations. Our closeness, built on patience, trust, and shared vulnerability, spoke louder than words ever could. We talked about everything and nothing, plans for the weekend, memories of childhood, books we loved, songs that lingered in our minds. And yet, beneath the easy conversation, there was a silent acknowledgement of something deeper. Every brush of fingers, every fleeting touch, every glance that lingered longer than necessary carried a language we had been crafting together, unspoken but understood. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she leaned slightly into me, her shoulder resting gently against mine. I felt the steady beat of her heart, and for a moment, I was fully aware of how alive and present we both were in this shared space. The tension that had once lingered between us had melted into a warm, unspoken harmony. The age gap, which had once felt like a subtle obstacle, no longer mattered. It was simply part of the unique story we were building together. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and steady. "I'm glad you're here." The words were simple, yet they carried everything we had been feeling: trust, comfort, longing, and acceptance. I turned slightly toward her, offering a small smile, and for the first time, the unspoken truth between us felt safe to acknowledge. We stayed there long after the sun had disappeared, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of shared presence. Every small gesture, the brush of hands, the tilt of heads, the gentle warmth of leaning together, was a promise in itself. No rush, no pressure, just two people who had found something rare and beautiful in each other. As I finally left that evening, the city lights twinkling below, I realized that our story had reached a point of peaceful fulfillment. The slow burn had led to trust, the tension to understanding, and the quiet moments of touch to a profound sense of emotional connection. And in that delicate, human way, we had found something extraordinary, a love that was patient, respectful, and utterly real.